Read. Well, first I would like to thank the invitation by Sven, Valdomiro, and the Concept to be here. And of course, I'm very happy to discuss with you, though the paper has already been published, so it may be too late now to, to correct and improve. But I would like to present some ideas. I don't work especially on reflection. I work on skepticism. But as you will see, skepticism is a kind of philosophical reflection on philosophical practice, on the activity of doing philosophy. So I think there may be some interesting things to say. I'm not going to defend the theory or a definition of reflection for skeptics, and I consider myself a skeptic. We don't produce theories, but perhaps this kind of reflection on philosophy might bring about some interesting results, something interesting to think, you know. So, for me, the most important clash or opposition in philosophy is that between dogmatists and skeptics. Of course, there are other kinds of conflicts. For instance, there are conflicts among different kinds of dogmatism, but then you must already have accepted that reason can establish, or philosophical reason can establish some doctrines. The question is to know which one is the correct or the true one, instead of merely suspending judgment. No? So I'm not going into fine discussions between different kinds of dogmatism. I will think most of the time only about the opposition between, on the one hand, dogmatists, and on the other hand, skeptics. The main point here will be that there is a kind of objection that dogmatists make to skeptics and vice versa. So skeptics usually say that dogmatics are rash. They precipitate their judgment and they accept or adhere to a doctrine too soon. So philosophical investigation should go on longer before one decides or makes up his or her mind. And the dogmatists, they say the same thing to skeptics, for they don't investigate too hard, they give up too quickly, they suspend judgment, they think it's not possible to find out the truth about a subject. And then instead of going on with philosophical investigation about what is true, they search or they seek only suspension of judgment because they have a practical goal, which is tranquility. And since tranquility is achieved by means of suspension of judgment, skeptics no longer seek truth, but they deliberately try to suspend judgment in order to enhance or to produce tranquility. So the point is this then. There is a philosophical investigation which is common to both dogmatists and skeptics. Who is guilty of rashness, in fact? Dogmatists or skeptics? Who is more truthful to the rational idea that we have to investigate both sides of a question in order to find out what is true? Those who decide for one side of the question, or those who suspend judgment between two sides? That's the main idea. And yeah, I was supposed to read this, but I prefer to talk instead of reading. And so the next point, I think, is that we have to understand what a philosophical investigation is. I think whoever is interested in philosophy in general, but in particular, whoever is interested in skepticism, is going to think or to reflect about the very activity of a philosophical investigation. So there's a sense in which what I am doing is a kind of performative act of a reflection about what we do, right? Thinking about our own way of thinking, about philosophical way of thinking. And I think this is not clear. At least to me, it's not obvious what we are doing when we do philosophy. And skepticism has this virtue of raising the question, what exactly are we doing? What do we expect from philosophy? So before trying to answer philosophical questions, perhaps we should pay more attention to the very thing we are doing, to reflect on what we do, usually. So I will argue, of course, that the skeptical stance is superior, in my mind, to the dogmatism. That dogmatism is rash, the dogmatic is rash, and the skeptic has a strategy not to be rash and to investigate further before we come to a decision. For this, I will have to, it's my particular interpretation of skepticism. We'll have to understand the role of suspension of judgment in philosophical investigation, and also the role of tranquility as a goal pursued by skeptics. Okay? So, as I said, I'm a skeptic, but this is very important, though I'm not going to explain in a long way. There are many kinds of skepticism, but let us distinguish, and I will insist on this distinction, between Cartesian skepticism, which is the most famous one, and Neo-Pyrrhonism. So, Pyrrhonian skepticism comes from old ages, from the time of Aristotle, but above all from Sextus Empiricus in the 2nd century. But recently it has been revived by some philosophers, notably in the States by Robert Foglin. I think Barry Stroud is also a Neo-Pyrrhonian. In Brazil we have perhaps our best philosopher, Oswaldo Porchat, called himself a Neo-Pyrrhonian. But there are other names, important names. I think that, for instance, Hilary Cornblyth, when he discusses disagreement, he brings about a general kind of skepticism that is not Cartesian. That's explicit, it's not my interpretation. So I think he has many similarities with Neo-Pyrrhonian philosophers, at least in these papers. And in Brazil we have examples in Argentina as well, so it's a different tradition. One of the differences from our contemporary image of a skeptic is that the skeptic is purely negative. It has only suspension of judgment. I think Neo-Pyrrhonism obviously has a positive, practical, and perhaps philosophical part as well. So this is something that will come up during the talk. I'm not going to explain that, because otherwise I would spend too much time. Yeah. So in the second place, I don't have a technical definition of reflection. I'm going to use more or less the ordinary sense. Perhaps there is no such thing as a well-defined phenomena to be described, explained, or understood, which is reflection as such. But of course, we use the word to many different activities we do, and all the main ones will be included here, and John has already done the job. Self-conscious or self-directed, you know. So thinking is perhaps the main point of reflection. And what I will do is to think about philosophical investigation, and then I will bring I will make some comments about philosophical reflection by thinking about philosophical investigation. So thinking about the way we think in philosophy while doing philosophy, no? It seems to me that we can perhaps distinguish, while we do philosophical investigation, when we do investigate, that perhaps we can distinguish two complementary sides. On the one hand, philosophers reflect on ordinary thinking, trying to produce a better view of the world, or perhaps to justify our view, but it lacks something, it lacks a justification, so philosophy has an important role, that if we are able to justify or explain our ordinary beliefs, then they are not mere beliefs, they are knowledge. Okay? But beyond that, I think, philosophers reflect also about what they do, what they produce. For instance, Kant thought about Hume. So he was thinking about what Hume did. So it's very, I think it's essential in doing philosophy that philosophers assess what other philosophers did. It's constitutive of the philosophical activity to reflect about or on the results of the first reflection. Now, so these two levels will appear in different parts of the talk. So to go back, I mean, what do I mean exactly by dogmatists and skeptics? So perhaps a dogmatic can be described as a philosopher who delivers a verdict, like a judge. He thinks about something, he examines, he reads arguments on both or more than two sides of a question, and based on these arguments or these cases for and against, he delivers a verdict. The verdict can be, for instance, colors are objective properties of things. Or, on the other hand, the verdict could be colors are nothing but subjective sensations produced by objects in us. And moreover, the philosophers in general, the dogmatists, they do not only deliver a verdict, they have a theory or an explanation in which he develops and supports his verdict. There must be an explanation or a justification of the verdict. Right? And the skeptic is that philosopher who, while doing the same thing, investigating a philosophical issue about whether colors are property or objective properties of things or not, he has no verdict. He cannot decide between the two verdicts. And so he has no particular doctrine to develop. Okay? So, point 5 is the mutual objections that I just explained. But I'm going to explain again with one or two more details. Yeah? For instance, when skeptics say that dogmatics are rash, is that because they deliver a verdict before they have listened or examined the case for an alternative view. They are rash in this sense. You have to read more, to think more, to know more about the issue before coming to a decision. And we are professors, we know. In the second year, many students are already the Heideggerian or Marxist or Quinian, Wittgensteinian or whatever. I mean, they didn't read enough to make up their minds. So they become dogmatists. Right? All I say is very empirical, in fact. I think I'm trying to describe what we do as a philosophical community, in fact. So I'm reflecting on our practice, you know. So as soon as a young philosopher reads a very strong paper or book, and then he adheres to this doctrine, then it's perhaps too late to read the objections. He will not see the weaknesses of this philosophy, nor he will not perceive the strength of other philosophies. So to be rash is really a problem, I think. On the other hand, the dogmatists think skeptics are rash, for they quit philosophical investigation too soon, because if they didn't make up their mind so far, and then they suspend judgment, and then they become tranquil, the initial disturbance is lost, is gone, and now he's in a serene condition. He will no longer seek truth in other topics. He will always try to suspend judgment. So he may be insensitive to the different forces of argument, the persuasiveness of some arguments, just because he wants to be tranquil. So he may pretend he is investigating, while in fact he's not. So it seems that it is impossible, and it seems that there is a kind of inconsistency or contradiction in the skeptical position, in the new Pyrrhonian position. I'm always talking about new Pyrrhonism. That is, that you cannot at the same time both pursue the truth and want to be tranquil. You have to choose, and the skeptic chooses to abandon investigation. That's why they are rash. They have to study more, read more, think more before suspending judgment. Perhaps they will find out the truth. I will try to show that skeptics can do both things at once. They can seek suspension of judgment and truth. Not only there is no contradiction in doing both things, that perhaps that's the final outcome. Epoché is not something that prevents us from seeking or searching the truth, but is something that will promote the investigation in the end of the day, right? And I will also argue that dogmatism is not entirely truthful to the very philosophical enterprise they carry out. So at some moment, at some point, dogmatists are not, I wouldn't say true philosophers, that is too much, but they are not faithful to what they proposed to do in the first place. If they were more truthful to the very philosophical enterprise of searching truth, they would perhaps become skeptics. That's the idea. Or they would become neo-Pyrrhonists, not Cartesian skeptics, right? So, point 2, philosophical reflection on ordinary thinking. So it's the first level of philosophical reflection when we think about the ordinary ways we all think, including philosophers, because philosophers are also ordinary people that live ordinary life. So, where does philosophical investigation begin? Where can we begin? And it seems to me that the starting point is our ordinary view of the world, our ordinary beliefs. Where else could we begin? We have to begin in a place that we all share, a view of the world that is common to all of us. If I start from some arbitrary hypothesis or premise, it's very easy for someone not to follow my inferences and reasonings. We must start where we are in ordinary life. And then we have to think about our ordinary beliefs, about our ordinary view of the world. And then, working from within, engaged in ordinary life, we can then reflect on our ways of thinking, can reflect philosophically. There are other ways to reflect on ordinary thinking. I'm talking only about philosophical reflection, whatever exactly that means, but and I will say that there are four ways of philosophical reflection about ordinary thinking. But before doing that, I would like to note two important points. I'm not going to argue for them. I think they need discussion. I think there are interesting discussions about these 2 points, especially the first one, but there is no philosophical investigation if you do not acknowledge your ignorance about what is at issue. So let us think, has reflection a positive value or not? That's a philosophical question. Well, I have to confess that I don't know the answer in order to investigate this question philosophically. Because if I know the answer, I don't need to investigate. I have already what I want. So if I'm searching a book and I have the book in my hand, it makes no sense to go on looking for the book, right? It's the same with philosophy. If I think I have, it's not that I have, but if I think I have the answer, I don't need to look for the answer. So I think it's a necessary condition of philosophical investigation that we, at the starting point, we acknowledge that we don't know the answer. We are going to inquire something, perhaps revise our worldview, but I don't know the outcome. And second, I must have an idea of what I'm looking for. Say, the true definition of reflection. I don't know the true definition of reflection, but I must have an idea of what reflection is, so that I can investigate which is the best reflection about the best definition of reflection. So sometimes philosophers, after having a general idea or loose idea of the topic, then they reach a precise definition and they offer to us as the true definition of the term. Then we can discuss if this definition is the good one or the other one is even better. But we must always have a general idea of what we are searching. And so I think in the case of reflection, we do have a general, maybe loose idea, but we do have an idea. So I think there are two dogmatic ways of thinking about ordinary thinking. There is what Strawson used to call revisionary metaphysics, or the revisionary project. I mean, that's what most philosophers did, you know. So we think about human beings, then come Descartes and say, no, we are wrong. Our idea of a human being is completely wrong. I mean, here is the true description of a human being. So it's a dualism, soul, which is a thinking substance, and the body, which is a so this is one way, is to attack ordinary thinking in order to promote a best scheme, a better theory about the world, better in the sense of the true one. There is also the justificatory project, which is not so hard on ordinary beliefs. I mean, most beliefs are okay. What they need is a philosophical justification. As they stand, they are perhaps good beliefs, true beliefs, but they need something in order to become knowledge. So the epistemological task is to provide this justification, which, together with our ordinary beliefs, we will then come to a knowledge of the world. There are two skeptic ways of thinking about ordinary think. The negative Cartesian skeptic way. The aim is, I mean, here also ordinary beliefs are problematic. I mean, they are always a bit problematic, I think. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing philosophy. But our ordinary view of the world is intrinsically problematic. Everything is put in doubt. So the conclusion or the outcome is that we have no knowledge whatsoever. So we have the dream argument, the demon argument, or whatever, the brains in a vat. But this is not the kind of skepticism I like. I think there are many problems. But here I will just point out that the main problem is that of course, ordinary beliefs are in need of some criticism. There are many false beliefs, unsupported beliefs. But we have to work from within and accept many of them, even to start philosophical investigation. Otherwise, we would have nothing to work upon. And so some disengagement, some detachment is, I think, healthy. It's not only possible but desirable, but perhaps such a general detachment as the two dogmatic ways tries to do, or the first skeptical way try to do, I think it may be impossible. I'm not going to argue for that. But here I would like to make a small description of the positive part. Since if the Neo-Pyrrhonism accepts our ordinary view of the world and try to assess it critically, but not in general, but in part, I mean, it can accept what here I call an engaged investigation, which is a kind of, for instance, scientific investigation. So we can explore and improve our knowledge of the world by doing empirical science. Neo-Pyrrhonism has nothing against that. So I think this is very important. I mean, this is a very vague and general idea, you know, but the world in which we live in is known by ordinary practices, but it is further known, and our ways of thinking about the world can be improved by doing empirical science. So Neo-Pyrrhonists have nothing against that, engaging in ordinary practices and then in a more refined empirical investigation about the world. For us, Neo-Pyrrhonists, this has so far nothing to do with philosophy, or at least not necessarily. Philosophical investigation is non-empirical. Just take the example. Colors. Are colors objective properties of objects? Well, my trouser is brown. If that answer is a good philosophical answer, of course they are objective properties. It's a property of my trouser. But of course you will feel that this answer is wrong. It does not answer the philosophical question about color being an objective property. Because most, or at least many, but perhaps most philosophical questions are not empirical questions. They are not to be answered by ordinary practices or scientific investigation. They need a special kind of argument that leads us not like smoke and fire, you know, for something that is present here, but not present perhaps to the senses. I see smoke, I infer fire, I see a scar, I infer a wound. That is, we can connect things that are part of the world we live in. Philosophers try to infer something that has a special, that needs a special inference in order for us to say we know that, for instance, reflection has a positive value or not. One thing is to carry out an empirical investigation about the value of reflection. I have nothing against that. Some evidence points to the fact that in many cases reflection is important, and experience shows that in some other cases reflection may be bad for knowledge. You know, as a Neo-Pyrrhonist, I have no a priori opinion. We have to investigate what goes on in the world when we reflect in this or that situation. But it seems to me that when we do philosophy and we raise questions like, does reflection have a positive value, we want more than that. We want to establish by an argument based not only on evidence, but we neo-Pyrrhonists call the evident, something that is true. And by an inference of something true, we conclusively arrive at the conclusion yes or no, and then we deliver a verdict. Arguments of these kinds are different from empirical arguments. Well, if you want, they are kind of armchair arguments. But the idea here is that they lead us beyond what can be empirically discovered. Of course, these arguments may include empirical data, empirical reflections, but also they are intended, or they are meant to go beyond what is merely discoverable by empirical research. So that's why I think, this is a very fine and refined and difficult point, because what I'm trying to do is, by reflecting on what we do, I'm trying to describe what kind of question we raise to ourselves. And I think this is not immediately obvious. I think it's very difficult to describe the way we raise questions, the meaning of our questions. Our philosophical arguments may include empirical arguments, but they go beyond that. So what do we do? Well, sometimes we may make some observation of the world, we may read scientists, we may use their results. But also we have to move beyond that, because it's not merely an empirical question, it's something about, the structure of the world, essences or natures of things or whatever. But what is important now, at least what I would like to describe more, reflecting on what we do, is philosophy involves not only verdicts and doctrines if you are dogmatic, or suspension of judgment if you are a skeptic or a neo-Pyrrhonist, but it also involves abilities. When we investigate philosophically, we do some things. We do not go into a lab and do some empirical research. No, we do not invent, except perhaps theoretically, experiments. We may have thought experiments, but we don't do real experiments usually. But we develop an ability to argue in specific ways. These specific ways may be many different ways. But I'm going to simplify, as always. It's maybe a huge subject. But for instance, when we go to the university and we learn philosophy for 4 or 5 years, and we do a PhD, and then we write papers or books, we give talks, what exactly do we learn? What kind of abilities do we acquire? If you are dogmatic, I think you acquire the following ability. Since philosophical investigation is always a matter of knowing, understanding, and assessing different and opposing arguments. Since I deliver a verdict, and I think one side is stronger than the other, when I present a paper, when I write a book, and I have to argue for one conclusion against the other, I must have the ability to show to my reader or listener that this side is stronger than the other one, that these arguments are better than these ones, that these objections are met by these philosophers here, but these objections to this side are decisive. I have to convince my reader or my listener that one side is stronger than one, and that requires a lot of ability. That's not easy. Philosophy is very difficult. And to persuade, and that is a bit funny, because we learn, and most of us are dogmatists. what we learn when we learn to do philosophy is to learn to be dogmatic. So we learn to persuade other people. But as a matter of fact, we never persuade. That's a curious, if not funny, outcome of this way of doing philosophy. But of course, if you become a skeptic, quite a few people do, but some do, you learn different abilities. I think, for instance, you learn the following ability, an exegetical ability. You learn the ability to read, to understand, and to use dogmatical material in favor of skepticism. So that's why skeptics have always been known as erudite people, because it's part of their training to know a lot of history of philosophy, to know very well what most dogmatic philosophers did. And they have to explain what they said and make them clash one against the other in a proper way, so that they may appear of equal persuasiveness when we are talking about the conflict between different kinds of dogmatisms. And but also there is another kind of ability which could be said called skeptical ability, which is the following. Usually most dogmatists agree on some points. So no one developed arguments for the other position. So both sides are not balanced. In philosophical investigation is always a matter of assessing opposed arguments. But sometimes you have only positive arguments. You don't find the negative ones. So the skeptic must use his or her creativity. He must invent arguments as good as dogmatic arguments. To give an old example, all philosophers in ancient times believed in gods. No one never gave an argument whose conclusion was, therefore, gods do not exist. Who did it for the first time? A skeptic, Carneades. He invented many arguments, and he thought they were as good as the arguments for the existence of God. He invented the arguments for the inexistence of gods, not because he was a disbeliever in the sense he was an atheist, in order to suspend judgment, to show that we can, in a proper philosophical investigation, find out good arguments on both sides. So, when dogmatics do not offer negative arguments, skeptics had to invent these arguments. That's why we tend to think that a skeptical argument has the following conclusion: we know nothing. But that is merely a dialectical argument invented to oppose. Like, there are gods, there are no gods. There is knowledge. All dogmatic philosophers think there is knowledge. They may disagree about which knowledge, what we know exactly. But no, or almost no, dogmatic philosopher argues that nothing can be known. So the skeptics had to fulfill this empty space. So, and this requires a different ability that is not merely exegetical. So, so I think that we have to think more about what the abilities involved in skepticism. So, Pierre Bell, a French philosopher of the 17th century, he described, quoting Plutarch, he has this idea that the dogmatists act, in fact, they think they are a judge, but in fact they act like a lawyer. They defend a case. When they defend a case, they employ their ability only showing the strong side of the case and trying to avoid it, to omit the weak side. And at the same time, when he describes the other position, he's going to show only the weakest parts, or those against which he has good arguments, and he will avoid explaining to us the strong part of the other view. Whereas the skeptics, since he or she wants to balance both sides, will try to show both sides at their best. If at their best both sides are equally persuasive, rationally we should suspend judgment. We cannot choose. So that's why Sextus Empiricus was a very good source for ancient philosophy, because he was always present dogmatism at their best, truthfully. Now, he was not acting like a lawyer. He was acting like the person who writes what is said on both sides. But that's not enough, as I said. He had to invent arguments as well, not only to report what has been said. He had to use dogmatic material to the purpose of Pyrrhonism or New Pyrrhonism. Now, let's go back, and I hope to finish in 10 or 15 minutes. I think I have 15 minutes, right? Yeah, some 15 minutes. Yeah, it will do. So, let's go back to this philosophical idea that a philosophical investigation is above all an investigation of arguments said pro and con of both sides of a question. And that is what all philosophers do, but some philosophers do that trying to show that those two sides do not balance, while the skeptic try to show that they match each other, they have equal force of persuasiveness. And this is, I think, the crucial point, and this is perhaps new to John, because when I presented the paper I didn't have this idea well developed. I think now it is, and I think this is the main point which was lacking last time, which is the following: this principle of opposition, that we have to oppose arguments so that they balance, both sides have equal force, the arguments for both sides have equal force of persuasiveness so that we suspend judgment. That dictates what I call the rhythm of philosophical investigation. This is a bit methodological and normative. See, that's a skeptical principle, and that's normative. The way we should do philosophy. Simplifies, in the morning I'm going to read the positive arguments. All the arguments I find, for instance, for the idea that reflection has a positive value. Of course, I'm a human being. I'm describing people, a community. I mean, I get hungry after 4 hours. Well, sometimes after 3 hours of study in the morning. Then I stop for lunch. What do I do in the afternoon? Well, since I read positive arguments that reflection has a positive value, in the afternoon I go and I'm going to read Kornblith. You know, I've seen some talks. It seemed so interesting, and now, you know, he has good arguments against the idea that reflection is so important or guaranteed. You know? Well, I spend a few hours during the afternoon. This is just a metaphor, you know? It need not be morning and afternoon, but I find it funny to think, when is tea time? When does the skeptic stop, you know, during the day where he investigates philosophy and has his tea at 5? Why at 5? Because at 5, not only because he's English, but because at 5, the arguments he read in the afternoon were as persuasive as the arguments he read in the morning. So he says, well, now it's time to stop. Temporarily, provisionally. It's not an end in the investigation. But if you remember the idea that acknowledgement of ignorance is a necessary condition for the investigation, the next day he can go on investigating, because at tea time he delivered no verdict. That was the moment in which he was in the position not to deliver any to accept any doctrine, whatever, or to deliver. So when both sides balance, he said, well, enough for today. Tomorrow I will go on investigating. Suppose that not at 5, but at 3, he still thinks reflection has a positive value. I mean, he just read the first chapter of a book or just one paper, not 3 papers like in the morning. So he still thinks that those arguments need answers. So he's not yet as persuaded as by this argument as he was by the other one. So that's rashness. If he stops investigation at 3 p.m., he becomes a dogmatist. He will perhaps, he would perhaps no longer deliver the verdict, the positive verdict, if he would go on investigating. But now suppose he does not stop at 5. I mean, he's a hard worker. I mean, he doesn't like tea. His stomach, he has stomach problems. So he goes on until 7. Then he delivers the negative verdict, not the positive one. So he read much more about reflection not having a positive value. In fact, it's a problem for the functioning of our knowledge, that now he becomes convinced of the opposite. Well, here he's not, usually negative philosophers are not so rash, but anyway, they deliver a verdict. He should stop at 5, and then the next day, as the investigation goes on. So that dictates a principle and a rhythm for the investigation. That's how we should do when we do philosophy. And if we do that way, first, we suspend judgment, because now it's no longer ignorance. Now it's a real suspension of judgment. Because ignorance is before we investigate. After we investigate, some investigation, then we suspend judgment because we know opposite verdicts and we don't deliver a verdict. So now it's suspension of judgment. That is, we don't know. So the condition, the necessary condition to go on investigating is preserved. And that is why, so suspension of judgment is not like what the objection says. It's not something that prevents us to go on searching. Suspension of judgment is precisely the only thing that preserves investigation, that allows us to go on investigating the next day. Otherwise, if I know the answer, the next day I'm going to do another investigation, not this one. This one is solved, but because of rashness. So dogmatists are not truthful to the very idea of philosophical investigation and being impartial to both sides. So I have said a little bit about point 15 now, and this is how do we know the persuasive force of an argument? That is also a very difficult question, and my suggestion is the following. The idea of an intrinsic persuasive force of an argument is a dogmatic idea. I'm not a dogmatic, so I don't think that arguments have intrinsic persuasive force. You know, I think that the force of an argument is always context relative. It depends with whom I'm talking about, the premises of the person to whom I'm talking, or the audience, or the context, if the person is religious, or whatever. Arguments depend, are intersubjective. So an argument may be good for one person and bad for another one. So for the other person, I will have to use other kinds of arguments that are effective to this person and not to the other one. It may sound that arguments are merely subjective then, you know? So I can say, well, to you, skeptic, both arguments seem equally persuasive, but to me, they don't. And that's enough for me. So I prefer this side. I deliver this verdict, I reject the other one. Well, I think there is something subjective, but it's not only subjective, I think it's intersubjective. I think here the idea that people who discuss epistemology of disagreement discuss whether numbers matter. I think there is one sense in which numbers matter. Because if it's not subjective, it's not an intrinsic force, an argument is a strong argument in philosophy when it's able to attract many good philosophers. So many good philosophers, or many philosophers, if you don't want to put the good in it, many philosophers accept this or that version of this argument. So this is a good argument. But of course, many other philosophers do not accept this argument, but the other argument as well. So this other argument also is strong because it's able to attract many people adhere to this doctrine because of these arguments. So in this sense, numbers matter. If an argument attracts no one or just one or two people, I mean, it's not a good argument in philosophy. But if you have, as Kornblith says, half of the community are internalists and half of the community is externalist, then arguments on both sides are more or less equally persuasive. They were able to capture not only the attention but the assent, the approval of many philosophers. So I think that since there is opposition and disagreement, and in most issues the community is divided always. This is for me a sign or evidence that these arguments are equally plausible, though I have no objective standard. No, I cannot measure that, but it's not merely subjective. So we suspend judgment, and then tranquility is achieved. Now comes a point which is not so new, but it's in the paper. It's not so important as I thought before, but I think it has some importance. Usually we think that tranquility is produced by epoche, by suspension of judgment. We were disturbed, we wanted to know the truth, then we suspend that judgment, and by chance tranquility happens. I become a serene person. But then I go on investigation. Precisely because I suspend the judgment, I can go on inquiring the next day. But then I go on inquiry, not disturbed by my own ignorance, not disturbed. I'm no longer ignorant. I mean, I suspend judgment, it's a bit different. But above all, I'm no longer disturbed by not knowing what I want to know. I will peacefully investigate more in the morning, the positive arguments, more negative arguments. In the afternoon, probably suspension of judgment will follow. If not, I will deliver a verdict, but my expectation is that the tide will go on, and I'm peaceful. So what is important here is the following idea. Tranquility is not only a product of suspension of judgment, tranquility is also a condition of the investigation. Skeptic investigation goes on not under stressed conditions, not under a disturbed condition, an anxiety to know the truth. But I can go on searching what is true now without being disturbed. That means it's not that there is a conflict between having tranquility as a goal and truth as a name of the investigation. Well, here perhaps I will distinguish between three things, and then I will close my talk. One thing is the goal of the investigation, which is external to the investigation. It's like, I'm a doctor or a physician and I want to cure someone, to bring that person to good health. Now, I have to investigate about his condition, the disease, the causes. So the aim of the investigation, for instance, is to know what caused the disease, so that by interfering with this cause, I may produce my goal, which is health. So I can investigate the cause of a disease. That's the aim of the investigation, because I have the external goal, which is not a goal of the investigation, but of my practice as a physician, which is to cure people. So both things, and one can investigate without caring about health of people, and one can worry about health of people without doing investigation, and one can do both things at the same time. One does not exclude. And besides the goal and the aim, we have to distinguish also the end. That means when one stops doing the investigation. Usually it's when the aim is reached. So the skeptic does not end, except perhaps temporarily, momentarily till the next day. So if you want another metaphor, I mean, you are in the U-Bahn, the underground. So the rash philosopher, the dogmatist, he gets out of the train before the end of the last station and the last station. And the skeptic does not get out of the train. He goes on investigation. He does not put an end. He does not think he has reached the last step of the investigation. He goes on. I mean, maybe one day he will reach the very last station or the final bus stop. But so far we don't know. We cannot say this is the last one. We have to go on investigate. And so Neo-Pyrrhonism for me is the Neo-Pyrrhonist is the guardian of philosophical investigation. The true philosopher that is faithful to the very idea of arguing on both sides of a question while searching for the truth. And this, all this, I hope, is a kind of product of philosophical reflection on philosophical activity, and I think this is positive, but it's not an argument to say reflection is always good. Okay, thank you.